Hey guys, it's Lauren from Girly Knits, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to knit a ruffle scarf. So this was a scarf that I had designed for my master's collection, and it incorporates two different ways of knitting ruffles. One of them is using short rows, which I'm going to be demonstrating today in the video, and another way is knitting a really long panel and gathering it and joining it to create this ruffled trim, which I'll also be showing you in this video. I'm going to be demonstrating using my SK840, which is a standard gauge knitting machine, but the original sample was actually knit on my LK150, so you can definitely use an LK150 as well. You can get the gauge on either machine. I do have a pattern for this scarf, which includes step-by-step instructions and lots of up-close photos, and it has the tensions that you would use on either machine to get the gauge. So if you want that, you can find it on Ravelry, where I'm Girly Knits, or you can always find all of my patterns and tutorials at girlyknits.com. So the gauge we're working with today is 24 stitches, and 34 rows equals 4 inches in stockinette stitch, though I have to say the gauge isn't super important because this is a scarf and it's not like a fitted garment. If you get somewhere close to there, that's fine. What's actually important with this design is that you get somewhat of a loose gauge. The thing that makes this scarf beautiful is that it has a nice drape, so you don't want something too tight, but rather something a little bit more open work that's gonna give you this nice drape that the ruffle has. The original version of this scarf uses a thread weight metallic yarn, which you can see here. It is really thin, and then it's paired with this eyelash yarn, which is a bulkier yarn. It's really super soft and it has this feathery material. And so those combined together provide this contrast that you get in the scarf that makes it really lovely. I've made some other versions of this scarf, including the one I'm wearing, where I used a lace weight yarn throughout, so that is another option that's in the pattern that you can do. I also made this version, which uses a fingering weight yarn, so it's a bit heavier, and I made this about half the length that I did the original one, so you can wear it more like a shawl. And back here is another version that I made, which also uses a lace weight yarn, and it's long like the original. And so there's tons of options within the pattern for different yarns and techniques that you can use. The original sample is about 80 inches long, and I did 13 repeats of the small and large Gore pattern, which I'm going to be showing you in the tutorial today. In the tutorial, I'll be showing you just 2 repeats to make a swatch, so if you want to knit along with me and make a swatch, I encourage you to try really whatever yarn that you prefer. If you have some yarn in your stash that you'd like to use, you can have a lot of fun trying different yarns and seeing what you like. All right, let's get started. All right, so to start off, we're going to do an E-wrap cast on, and we're going to be doing a total of 45 stitches, and we're going to start at 10 left and go all the way to 35R. And doing that's just going to make it a little bit easier when we're doing our short rows to see which ones we are putting on hold, which will make more sense later. But we just want to take our yarn and E-wrap over these needles. All right, so then we just want to put our yarn in the carriage. And I have my tension set to T6, but that might depend on which yarn you're using. And then I'm going to put my weaving brushes on just for these first 6 rows or so. If you are using a machine that doesn't have weaving brushes like the LK150, you just want to pull the needles out to D position every row for like the first 6 rows to get this going. But yeah, so we're just going to knit across. And just to demonstrate, if I didn't have these weaving brushes, I would just want to hold the knitting back and bring these out to D position each time. But luckily with this machine, we have these brushes which help knit these initial rows. So I have enough knitting here now, about 6 rows where I can hang my weights. So I'll just go ahead and do that. And then we can turn those weaving brushes off and just knit like normal now. So we want a total of 10 rows to start. So since I've done 6, I'm just going to do 4 more. All right, so now we want to start doing our partial knitting. So I'm going to turn my settings so the Ruffle levers go from 2 to 1 so that any needles in D position will be on hold. That might be different depending on your machine. And then we're going to put these first 10 needles, which are easy to see since it's from 10 left to 0. We're going to put those in D position. And then we are going to knit across. and these should be in hold. So next we're going to take one needle on the left and put that in holding position, and that's just going to prevent holes when we're going back and forth. And then we're going to knit from left to right. And then after that, we are going to put 4 stitches from working position to holding position and basically repeat these 2 rows. So we're going to go 4, 1, 4, 1 until we have 4 stitches left on the right that are in work. So we're going to knit across, put 1 stitch in hold, and then do 4, and then 1, 4, and 1. We're just going to continue in that manner until there's 4 left. And we don't really need to keep track of rows. This is just kind of visually you can see each time. And a way to check if you're on track is every time you pull out 4, you should be hitting either a 10 or a 5, because it's basically like increments of 5, the 4 and the 1. Hopefully that makes sense. So each time you pull out 4, yeah, you're gonna hit one of the markers on your machine, and then the 1 will be, oh, sorry, because we didn't knit this row yet. So here we go. So we knit that one, and then the 1 will be just past the markers for where your numbers are. So now that we have 4, we've reached the end of our gore, and we're going to work backwards. And to start, we're going to put 3 needles in work, and we're basically working back and creating another gore of short rows, but we're kind of spacing them out a little bit, because if they were exactly in the same spot, it might create holes. So yeah, they're just a little bit offset. So we're going to start with 3 in work and work across. And then again, we're going to do 1 each time we're going from left to right to prevent holes. So that was how we got started, and now we're going to go back in that 4-1 pattern. So we're going to put 4 in work, and then 1 in work, and then 4 in work, and 1 in work. And then just like the last time, if you're getting a little bit lost or you forget where you are, each time you put 4 in work, it should be 2 on either side of either the 5 or 10 stitch marker. So hopefully that makes sense. We have that little dot right there, and we have 2 on either side. And then we're going to do 1. And then we have 4, 2 on each side of the 1. And then 1. But basically in that same pattern. And then 1. And then when we reach 1 stitch before that initial wrap stitch, which was right next to 0, another way to double check this is when you have 12 needles that are still in D position, we've reached the end of that large gore. So what we're gonna do is put our Russell levers back to 2, and then we're going to knit 20 rows. So that's basically the end of the gore, and you can kind of see it right here forming. Now we're going to put some space between it before we knit our next gore. So I'm just gonna go ahead and knit 20 rows. All right, so now we can move our weights up. And then just to show you what this looks like, we could remove this as well. You can see it's just kind of created like a triangle there, and that is our large gore. And now we're going to do a smaller gore, and we're gonna alternate between the large gore and the small gore. So for the small gore, we are going to put 25 needles in hold on the left-hand side. So we're going to put up to 15 right. So let's see right there. So 10 on the left of 0 and 15 to the right of 0 are going to be in hold. And then again, we're going to put our Russell levers to 1 so the needles in deep position won't knit. And then we're going to knit across. And then we're going to bring 1 to holding to prevent holes. And then we're going to do that same pattern of 4 and 1 all the way across. So 4 and 1. And then 4 and 1 until we have 4 left. And then we're going to do the same thing we did last time to get started to work back up this gore. So we're going to put 3 into work and then work across just for that initial row, and then we're going to put 1 in work, and then 4, and then 1, and then 4, and then 1. So now we've again reached 1 needle before that first wrap needle, which we started 15 over. So another way you can double check this is when you have 10 to the left and 17 to the right and hold. That's when the small gore is done because we've reached the beginning of it. And again, we want to switch our Ruffle levers back to 2 so that all needles will knit, and then we're going to work another 20 rows. All right, so we've now done a full repeat of these large and small gore. We're just going to be repeating these 2 until you have the length that you're happy with of your scarf. So I'll show it one more time, but basically you can keep track by counting the gores. Those are pretty easy to identify. You just want to count how many large gores that you end up with, and that will help calculate your ruffle. And you can also just use a ruler if you decide beforehand how long you want your scarf to be. I find it helpful if you have one that you like, perhaps, that you like the length of, measuring that. And yeah, you can just kind of eyeball it. You don't really have to do any calculations beforehand. So, all right, so we're gonna knit another large gore. So we're gonna put our Ruffle levers back to 1 again, and we're gonna put these first 10 needles in hold. And then we're gonna knit across, put 1 in hold, and then 4, and then 1, and then 4. Again, you can see like we get to a little marker each time, and then the 1 in hold will be just past that in case you want to make sure that you're on track with this. And then we've just gotten to the end here where we have 4 left, so we're going to put 3 into work, and then knit across, and then 1, and then we'll go back into the 4 and 1 pattern. And you can definitely try different variations of gores, depending on how many needles you put in between each row. You always want that wrapping row, of course, but you could do, you know, 1 at a time, or you could space them out even more. Basically, the fewer needles you have, the more ruffly it will be. I like this 4 in 1 pattern because I thought it created a nice ruffle where, yeah, just like a nice wavy ruffle, but I've definitely tried like super ruffly versions too of experimenting with this, so I definitely encourage you to experiment. So now we're back to the beginning of our gore. I can see that first wrap stitch there, and we're 1 needle away from it, and then we have the 12 needles that are in hold still, so that means we're at the end of our gore, and then we're going to knit another 20 rows. All right, so now we're going to do another small gore. So again, we're going to put 25 needles in hold. So 10 on the left and 15 on the right. Change our Ruffle levers. Knit. And then go back into that 4 in 1 pattern. And then we'll put 3 into work, and then 1, and then 4, 1, 4, 1, and then we've reached the end of that small gore. As I can see that wrap right there where we started. So because we're at the end here, this is when you finish your scarf, you're gonna finish a full repeat. So we started with 10 rows, and then we knitted 20 rows in between each gore, and now we're gonna end with 10 rows so that it evens out the repeat. So yeah, we're gonna finish with 10. So just for this swatch here, since I'm just showing you a small piece of this, but otherwise you keep going in that pattern. So I'm just gonna knit 10 rows. And then we're going to bind off. Now, there's different ways you can do this. My preferred bind off method is a chain bind off, just because it's really easy. So for this, I just want to go to my highest tension. Usually I like to do a tension that I'm using +6. Because I'm using T6, that would be 12, which our machine doesn't go up to, but I'm just gonna go up to the highest tension, which is 10.2, which is, it's good enough, it's close enough. If you are using the highest tension, you'd manually wanna work the last row to make sure that it was loose enough for a chain bind off, because you do want it looser than your main tension, but I'm just gonna use the highest tension on this machine and knit that row. And then we're going to use our latch tool to do a chain bind off. So to set up for that, we're just gonna, I like to move my stitches at an angle, like this, and we're gonna get our latch tool. And you do want some weight, more so like what you're moving towards, you want weight there, but not necessarily right under your work. So I've found that that works the best. So we're just going to use our latch tool to go through each stitch, draw it through, and take it off. And we'll be using this technique again for this scarf. I use it a lot. It's just become kind of my favorite, but as I said, if you have another way that you like to bind off, that is totally fine. You're not really going to see this edge, and so I just find this to be the quickest and simplest method. So as we're reaching the end here, it feels a bit trickier with these finer yarns. You just don't want the latches to come out of the hook, the stitches to come out of the hook. So just be a little careful here. I'm just kind of holding it with that weight still on. You could take the weight off too if you just want to use your hand to use the weights, but we're just at the last one. And then I'm just going to break this. We don't need to leave a special tail. And then I'm just going to pull that through. And then you can see created this little swatch here. So this is our edge right here. And yeah, that looks good. And you can see there's just a subtle ruffle that forms from those gores. All right, so next we're going to be picking up stitches to prepare to join to the ruffle. Even though we haven't knitted the ruffle yet, I would recommend doing this next step just in case you want to double check how many stitches you pick up, because that's going to affect how many stitches for the ruffle that we make. So to pick up stitches, we are going to pick up along the ruffled edge. So that's the part with more stitches, because that's what we'll be attaching our ruffle to. So to get started, we're just going to pick up that very last stitch, and then we're basically picking up the loops, so the looser of every other edge stitch. So they're referred to often as loops and knots. So yeah, the tight one would be challenging. So we're just gonna pick up the one that's easy to pick up. So it can be a bit tedious picking up these little stitches, particularly if you're using a thread weight or lace weight yarn. I do find one technique that helps if you have a circular needle like this. I'm using a US size 1, is to actually use your right needle to help pick up every loop. I found that to be a bit of a help. And the reason we're doing this is it just will make it easier when we do end up hanging it on the machine to have these picked up already. You could just pick them up and hang them on the machine. You could just eye it, but I find that a lot more challenging. It'll make your life a lot easier if you pick them up in advance. All right, so I finished picking up my stitches, and because I did 2 repeats of the large and small gores, I've picked up 80 stitches, so it should be 40 stitches per large and small gore repeats. If you did the math, there'd be 80 for each large and small gore repeat, 80 rows, and then because we're picking up every other stitch, it's going to be 40. So 40 times 2 is 80. And then we want to keep that in mind for calculating our ruffle. So basically our ruffle is going to be knit vertically. If you did a ruffle, let's say across like the entirety of the needle bed, that would limit you to how many stitches you could hang. But if you do it the other way, if you go vertical, you can just make it as long as you want. And so we're going to be doing that. And then I came up with a little technique that makes it a bit easier to hang your ruffle. We're going to be doing double the amount of rows that we picked up because we want to knit 2 rows to attach to every picked up stitch we have there to create more of a ruffle. It'll probably make more sense as we go along, but we're just going to start casting on for our ruffle. And so to do that, because I'm using this eyelash yarn, which is a bit chunkier, we're going to be using the highest tension and casting on every other needle. With the samples I showed you that had the same yarn for the scarf, I casted on from 25 to 25 and skipped the middle 2 stitches, which I'll show in a second, and worked the same tension as I did the scarf. But because of this eyelash yarn, which is a bit heavier, we're going to do it a bit different. So we're going to cast on every other needle from 31 to 31. And then, let's see, we can use our tool here to just do every other needle. And then we want to leave the center for an out of work position. And then again, so from 31 left to 3 left, we want every other needle cast on. And then from 3R to 31R, we want every other needle. So we'll just use this tool do every other needle and then take those ones we're not using out of work. And then we just want to do an E-wrap cast on. So we do want to leave a tail to start our ruffle because I think it looks nice if you seam it when you're finished. So I'm just going to leave a 15-inch tail, and then that will help us seam our ruffle when we're finished. So we're just going to do an E-wrap cast on over every other needle. And if you count them, it'll be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 on each side. Okay, and then we're gonna put our yarn in the carriage, and again, I just have that at the highest tension. Gonna leave this clip here, and then I'm gonna turn my weaving brushes on just for these first 6 rows, and then we do wanna count rows this time, so we're just gonna get started. So I've just knit 6 rows, so I'm just gonna hang some weights. And then I'm gonna turn those weaving brushes off. Like I said before, if you're using like an LK150, for example, you just wanna bring out those needles to deposition every row until you get enough to hang some weights. So now we can continue knitting. And then, so as I was saying before, we want to knit 2 rows to hang to connect with every stitch that we picked up for the scarf. So because we picked up 80 for just this little swatch, we're going to be knitting 80 times 2, which is 160. So I'm just going to keep knitting here to show what this looks like. And you'll see that leaving these 4 out of work stitches here, it's going to create this column of bars. And this is handy because when we hang our ruffle and join it to the scarf, we're going to be folding this in half and using these bars as a guide for the stitches that we hang, which I'll show you in the next step, but that is the reason for that. And as I said, if you're not using an eyelash yarn, you just need like 2 in the center. You basically just want to create enough of a gap that it's easy to identify this column of stitches. So we're just going to keep knitting here until we reach 160 rows. All right, so I've just reached 160 rows, and so you can kind of see what this looks like. You want the ruffle to be about 3 inches, so it'll be folded and hung, so it's going to gain a little weight that way too, but basically it's going to be gathered like this to create the ruffle. So again, you could experiment with how big you want the ruffle to be. I thought 3 inches was a nice width, and this achieves that. And so now we're just going to bind off. So because we're already working at the highest tension and we want a loose tension to bind off, we're just going to do it manually. So we're just going to take our yarn out of the carriage, and then we're going to bring these working needles to D position. We want to make sure our weights are hung for this. So I'll put those back on. And then, so you just want to put the yarn in the latch and then just pull it all the way back, and that should create a nice loose bind off, especially if you're working with this weight of yarn. Just depends, but I found that moving it all the way back works well. Also because we were working every other stitch, so it's gonna create a even looser tension than normal. So we can just skip over those out of work stitches, that's fine. And then again, we wanna leave a 15-inch tail so we can seam our ruffle. So let's do. And then we are going to move these needles back out, which you might have to, because it's every other needle again. So just take a closer look. Let's see if I can use this tool this time. Maybe it makes it a little bit easier. Just to pop those guys out and then bring them forward. Okay, so again, we just want to kind of move these out. And then we're going to use our latch tool to do a chain bind off. So I just took the weight off. I find it just a little bit easier to use my hand for this part. Then we just have that last stitch there, and then we're just going to draw our yarn through. So now we're ready to hang our ruffle on the machine, and that's going to prepare us to join it to the scarf. So if you're making the full scarf, you'll want to use the full length of the bed and start at the very end and then go to the opposite end. You'll have more stitches to join than can fit on the machine, but you can just do it in segments. So I find it easiest just to do as many as you can, and then we'll put it on hold and then keep joining it, and I'll show you how to do that. But since we just have a small swatch here, and I know that ultimately we're hanging 80 stitches, I can just work from 40 to 40 here, and we're just gonna start by hanging the ruffle. So we want the right side of the ruffle facing. It doesn't really matter what edge you start at. If for any reason you might be like adding to the ruffle or subtracting from it for you know, if you wanted to like make it longer or something like that, potentially you could start at the bottom of the knitting as opposed to the top, because it'd be easier to like undo if you needed to do that, but we're not really worried about that. So I'm just going to start at either edge, the right side facing, and then we're going to ignore the cast on row, but then just see these bars here. We're going to be picking up 2 at a time and then hanging on the needles. So I'm just going to pick up those first 2 there, and then we'll hang it on at 40. So we're just going to continue in that manner, picking up 2 at a time and pulling it out, that needle out to D position. And hopefully it's easy to see the center of your knitting because we left those out of work stitches, which is a handy way, a handy trick to do if you need to do something like this where you're picking it up in the center. I just find it makes it so much easier. So you're welcome to experiment with your ruffle if you wanted to make it more ruffly or less ruffly. I found that hanging 2 rows to connect with each stitch on the scarf is good for this feather yarn, but when I was using the same yarn, I actually did 4 rows to connect with each row picked up on the scarf. I thought that made a nice ruffle, but I've also tried 3. You can certainly play around. I mean, you could even do more if you wanted it like super ruffly. Right, so I've just hung all of these ruffle stitches. As you can see, it kind of gains a little bit of length when you hang it, especially with this feather yarn, which has a bit of a looser gauge. So we have that there. You could hang some weights if you wanted. I'll just go ahead and do that. You don't totally have to, it's kind of up to you, because we'll be removing those later, but it does help a little bit to hang some weights. So now we're going to be hanging the scarf stitches, and we're going to be putting them in the hooks here, and then we're going to be pulling them through the ruffle stitches to join them. So to hang the scarf, we just want the wrong side of the scarf facing, and then we're just going to grab our one prong tool, and then having this needle here just makes it so much easier to hang the stitches and the latches. So all right, so we got our wrong side facing, and we're just going to hang one stitch in each latch. You'll find that you want to hang weights as you go. That's going to help keep the stitches in the latches. And you can kind of just rearrange them as you're going to even out the tension of the weight, just so they stay in there. All right, so we're just reaching that last stitch here, and then we just want to make sure that our weights are evenly weighting the scarf. All right, so basically we want to pull these back through those stitches. So what you can do is you can close all of these latches. I mean, they should, I'm just going to use my ruler to do this. There might be other ways. You don't totally have to do this, but I've noticed it is a little tricky with the eyelash yarn. Sometimes it gets caught on things. So just to make sure that those all go smoothly through. But then we just want to bring all these stitches back in unison. So we'll just do a little at a time so they don't get too far from each other. Just going to kind of inch those back. And again, if you're using the entire bed, yeah, it can be a little tricky just to get them all in unison, but do the best you can. And then you get to the point where you want to pull those through, and basically you just want to avoid like getting caught on the hung ruffle stitches. So just basically there, just gonna pull them through, and then you just want to pull back as far as you can go. Just really make sure it's joined. And we're also going to be doing another chain bind off, so it's just nice to have those stitches as big as they can be. And then we're going to slowly bring them forward so we can do a chain bind off, and that will be our join. We don't need to use any more yarn to join them. It's just kind of self-joining in that sense. So I'm just going to bring these out. And then I find it helpful to take off the weight on the ruffle. So it can be a little bit tricky if you're working with the entire bed, but you can do it. And then you just want to have weight joining the two as you go along. I'll just add one more in the end there. And we're just going to grab our latch tool, and just like before, we're going to do a chain bind off. So when you reach that very last loop, what you want to do is just put it on a stitch holder. So if you have a longer scarf, you would be joining all those and then put it on a stitch holder, and then you'd basically be starting again, hanging the ruffle and hanging your scarf. There would still be some stitches on the circular needle, but because we just did this little swatch, we were able to do it in one go. But otherwise, yeah, you could just put that stitch on a holder, and then you could just continue on as you continue joining it. But for this swatch, at least, we've finished it. So here you can see, yeah, doing that join we just did creates this really beautiful clean join where this is the right side of the fabric, and then this is the other side, which honestly looks nice as well, and it just has that little chain behind it. And then lastly, to seam this ruffle right here, this is pretty simple. You can just thread this tail that was left with a tapestry needle and put the right sides together. And what I just did is joined that either cast on or bind off row, just kind of seamed it, whip stitched it together, going through the V's on both sides. And then when I reached the stitch here to secure that, you can just bring that yarn through there, tie a couple knots, and then weave in the ends, and that will give you a nice finish and also secure that last stitch. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you found that helpful. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you want to find more of my machine knitting patterns, you can find them at girlyknits.com. I also have a lot of other machine knitting tutorials here on YouTube. You can find everything linked below, including ways that you can support this channel. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!